Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat.
Resolves.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Hello everyone, this is DJ and you're watching the Jumbo Commander YouTube channel. Today's deck tech features not a commander, but a simple common. Persistent Petitioners. 1 and a blue for a 1/3 human advisor. 1 in tap, target player puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. Tap 4 untapped advisors you control. Target player puts the top 12 cards of their library into their graveyard. And a wonderful line of text. A deck can have any number of cards named Persistent Petitioners. So we can build a deck with 4, 10, 20, 30 of these dinky little 1/3s. What are we doing in this deck? Well, let's break it down. First thing we have to do is figure out if this is a tribal deck. Are we going heavy in on advisors so that we can use this tap ability and have all these different advisors in it? I mean, I don't know. Are we just stacking it full of petitioners and that's the best advisor we can find? The next thing we have to deal with is if this is a mill deck, there's a dilemma when it comes to mill, and the problem is that it's not very good. I'll explain why, and that'll give us some perspective on what kind of mill cards we include in Commander. The next thing is that this is a common. Who's commanding this thing? This deck needs a commander, and we need to find the right one. And then finally, this is going to take a little while and a few hoops to jump through to get this deck going. So are we going to control the board? Are we going to try to protect our board? What's going on with all this stuff? Wow, it just sounds like this deck is destined to, I was about to say fail, but I think I'm going to revise that and say it's destined to be awesome. First thing let's get out of the way is the problem with mill and commander. Actually, it's the problem with mill in a lot of different formats. Mill is slang in Magic the Gathering for putting cards directly into the opponent's graveyard from their library. It comes from millstone, and it's an alternate win condition. If opponent ever tries to draw from their library and can't because they don't have any cards left, they lose the game. So the more cards you put into their graveyard, the closer you are to them not being able to draw and then you winning. The problem is that commander decks have a lot of cards. It's a lot. So Magic decks can be 40 cards in Limited, 60 cards in Constructed, and 100 cards in Commander. How on earth can you have a mill card that's balanced in all three? And the answer is it's very, very difficult. And so Commander suffers. And so some of the best cards we have do something like Mill 10 or like the Persistent Petitioners Mill 12. That, well, it's just not enough. Just imagine the same problem that Commander has with Burn. The reason why Lightning Bolt works in a format where you have one opponent and 20 life, it means that it doesn't scale well against 3 opponents at 40 life. Now, a card like Glimpse the Unthinkable might work just okay against one opponent with 60 cards, but now it gets even worse with 3 opponents all at 100 cards. Oh my gosh. The scaling is just all off, and so mill ends up at a loss. Let's look at our namesake card, Persistent Petitioners. If we have to mill, let's say 80 cards, let's say that our opponent draws 7 and draws 13 more cards throughout the rest of the game. Okay, that's probably a little bit, but that's fine, 80 cards. How many times do we have to activate Persistent Petitioners? 7 times. That's kind of a lot. If we were to translate this sort of killing effect into direct damage, it would be like tapping 4 Persistent Petitioners to do 6 damage to your opponent, because 7 activations of 6 damage each would kill the opponent. So you have to ask yourself, would you play a bunch of 1/3s that when you got 4 of them together, you could tap them all and deal 6 damage? I don't think so. It's not. And by the way, this is just a rough comparison. Milling is not the same as direct damage. There's so many more options for damage because you could actually attack someone or someone else could actually be attacked by another opponent. But instead, we're just milling cards. 7 activations? Oh, what have we gotten ourselves into? Well, hang on. We don't just run away when we're posed with the problem of mill. Instead, we jump right in and we find out if we can do it. By the way, we haven't really solved the problem of having multiple opponents. So if we have 3 opponents, that's 21 activations whilst having 4 Persistent Petitioners on the battlefield, and every untap. That's impossible. What can we do? Moving on. All right. Who is commanding these shenanigans? Well, some of the most common ones are Grand Arbiter Guest in the 4th, because it reduces the casting cost of your blue spells, and you're going to have a lot of Persistent Petitioners in this deck, making them a single blue. That's great. And he's an advisor. It just seems like they make sense so much. But then a bunch of other people are saying, look, play Phoenix. It's the best mill general out there. And they're not wrong. Phoenix is great. It says creatures you control have tap, target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is this creature's toughness. So do I lean into the advisor archetype and go for cheap explosive draws, or go with the heavier mill theme? Or do I ignore both of them and go with Zur the Enchanter? Yeah, I went with Zur the Enchanter. Zur the Enchanter is 1 white, blue, black. Oh my gosh, Esper. It includes both of those 2 cards that I enjoyed very much for this 1/4 flying wizard. Whenever Zur the Enchanter attacks, you may search your library for an enchantment card with converted mana cost 3 or less, put it onto the battlefield, and shuffle your library. Are there more powerful Zur archetypes out there? Most definitely. But are there more interesting ones? I highly doubt it, because we're going Zur Petitioner, Advisor, Tribal, Mill. All right, what does Zur bring to the table? Actually, Zur brings so much. Think about all of the amazing 3-drop enchantments that mill. Sphinx's Tutelage, Fraying Sanity, Memory Erosion. All of these are fantastic mill. Sphinx's Tutelage, whenever you draw a card, target opponent puts the top 2. That means they're milling 2 every single turn, and sometimes you'll draw more and mill more. Fraying Sanity doubles the amount of mill opponents take. So suddenly your 4 advisors are milling 24 instead of 12. That is a big difference. Memory Erosion reads, whenever your opponents do stuff, they mill. They're not going to stop doing stuff. They're going to keep milling. This incidental mill adds up, and there's even more. Navigator's Ruin. At the beginning of your end step, if you attacked with a creature this turn, target opponent puts the top 4 cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard. Yeah, we're not planning on doing a lot of attacking. Why is this in here? Well, I love that you have a bunch of 1/3s. And this targets an opponent, so you can play the politics game of attacking someone else for just a piddly little 1 damage, and then targeting a different player with the mill. Sounds great. Drown Secrets mills when you cast a blue spell. Persistent Petitioners, like a third of the deck, all blue. Amazing. And Psychic Corrosion, whenever you draw a card, each opponent puts the top 2 cards of their library into their graveyard. Yes. Every draw step, you're milling like 6. That is strong. But a lot of the real strength comes from Zur and the flexibility of fetching up enchantments. I have to say that one of the best ones out there is a new one, Estrid's Invocation. It's an amazing enchantment clone that you can reset every single turn, so you always have the best enchantment on the battlefield. Next up, we have Intruder Alarm. Yeah, you can fetch this up. Creatures do not untap during their controller's untap phases, and whenever any creature comes into play, untap all creatures. So what this reads is, oh, I'm going to have 4 advisors on the battlefield, I'll have you mill 12. Play an advisor, untap everything, mill 12. Play an advisor, untap everything, mill 12. It is a combo enabler that hopefully you enable better than your opponents, but it really is awesome. You know how I mentioned that mill is so problematic? Why don't we just turn mill into something useful, like damage? Bloodchief Ascension is awesome. It's a 1-drop enchantment, and it requires a little bit to get going. Your opponents have to lose some life. Doesn't matter, it'll happen eventually. Then, whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, okay, it could be from the battlefield because of a board wipe, it could be from your library straight in your graveyard, doesn't matter. Bloodchief Ascension, if it has 3 or more counters, which it will, you may have that player lose 2 life. If you do, you gain 2 life. Whoa, 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 whoa. Think of all these little instances of mill that you can have, and then suddenly it's Blood Chief Ascension has the ability to do crazy amounts of damage. And then combined with other effects like Duskmantle Guildmage, you can pay 1 blue-black, and it does a nice little imitation of Blood Chief Ascension. Whenever a card is put into an opponent's graveyard from anywhere, that player loses 1 life. By the way, you can activate this multiple times if you just have tons of mana, so you activate it like, I don't know, 3 or 4 times, and then activate your Persistent Petitioners and mill them for 12, then that's lethal. That's lethal! Yeah, that's crazy amounts of damage. And then also combine this with Mindcrank, because Mindcrank combos with these things. Mindcrank is just a simple little artifact that says whenever an opponent loses life, that player puts that many cards from the top of his or her library into his or her graveyard. So that means that you can suddenly weaponize other people's incidental damage and combo with these crazy cards. The next thing Zur can fetch is some protection, propaganda, and ghostly prison. We need this game to go long because we're milling people out. This is not going to be done quickly. And finally, we got a little bit of card draw coming from Zur, Necropotence. Powerful, fantastic. Just draw all the petitioners in your deck, hopefully. And then Rhystic Study, again, just a solid value enchantment for getting that card advantage. You need a lot of card draw in this deck because a lot of your cards are 1/3s for 2. Finally, we have a few more pieces of enchantment that Zur cannot fetch, but I wanted to mention here. Patient Rebuilding is really fun because it's an enchantment that gives you draw and incidental mill. I think it's really strong. And then that Phoenix I mentioned before, it really is good and deserves a spot in here. Maybe we have a few other pieces that work with enchantments like Academy Rector, which has become just prohibitively expensive, but it's here in case you want to cheat something out. And then Enlightened Tutor, a solid tutor for a lot of your enchantment pieces. Persistent Petitioners is an advisor, and it synergizes with other advisors. Maybe I can limit the amount of 1/3s for 2 I have in this deck if I can stack it full of other good advisors. Crossing my fingers that that strategy works out. We got Grand Arbiter Augustine IV. I mentioned before, this could be a commander for this deck, but I want the other colors. I want Zur's flexibility. So instead, Grand Arbiter just makes it into the 99, and it is worth it. Slowing down my opponents is important because I am not fast, and reducing the cost of petitioners is great because if I can draw a bunch of cards and then put explosive amounts of persistent petitioners onto the battlefield, then maybe I can tap more than 4, immediately sit down and tap 8 of them to mill someone for 24 out of nowhere and maybe close out a game. Council of the Absolute, another 4-drop advisor, and it lets me play a little bit of politics. I can name a card and my opponents can't play it. That's so good. Oh wait, it can't be a creature. Oh, I can't name commanders. Council of the Absolute would normally be very good and you'd see it a lot of places, but it's that one little clause, so we don't see it very often. I think I'm going to name like a common Wrath effect, especially if I know my opponent's deck. Let's move on to a little bit more powerful advisors. How about Orzhov Advocist? Sure, it distributes some +1/+1 counters, but it maybe prevents your opponents from attacking you. Teysa, Envoy of Ghosts. Sure, it's a 7-drop for a 4/4, but it dissuades your opponents from attacking you because you destroy them and then you get little 1/1 flyers. And Machiko Konda, Truth Seeker, is another rattlesnake. Whenever a source an opponent controls deals damage to you, that player sacrifices a permanent. Wow. That is a pretty steep cost for dealing damage to me. So with all of these amazing advisors protecting me, how am I going to capitalize? Well, I could just set up my defenses and mill, or I might be able to set up something like Azor's Elocutors. 3 and a hybrid Azorius for a 3/5 human advisor. At the beginning of your upkeep, put in a filibuster counter on Azor's Elocutors, and then if it has 5 or more filibuster counters on it, you win the game. I love alternate win conditions. I love advisors. I love the idea of a filibuster counter. And this is amazing. By the way, whenever a source deals damage to you, remove a filibuster counter. So you have to go 5 turns. 5 turns in a multiplayer setting without getting hit. Yeah, it's going to be real hard to trigger this, but it'll be very fun if you do. And Masako the Humorless, again, lets you tap your creatures, but then still block with them. I don't know. It's another advisor. We're gonna keep it. But there's some more Orzhov advisors that might give me more flexibility because of the life gain they grant. Agent of Mass, Cabal Council of Allocation, and Obsidian Ghost Council. All of these drain your opponents pretty regularly, and gaining life could be really, really good because, again, you're not closing out the game. This is mainly about life gain, not really about the damage, but, you know, maybe with the Mind Crank you could end up doing some damage. My final advisor is Loyal Retainers. This is just a good underplayed card in Commander. 2 and a white for a 1/1 human advisor. If you sacrifice it, you get a target legendary creature card from your graveyard straight onto the battlefield. Wow, that's pretty good. We have seven legendary creatures in this deck. Oh boy. Never mind. Let's live in Magical Christmas Land for a little while. Secret Salvage. 3 black, exile target non-land card from your graveyard. Read Persistent Petitioner. Search your library for any number of cards with the same name as that card. So you exile a single dead Persistent Petitioner and suddenly you can draw like 20 from your library. It's so fun. Okay, one more way to get huge amounts of Persistent Petitioners is Thrumming Stone. A 5 mana legendary artifact. Spells you control have Ripple 4. Some of you might be thinking, what, Ripple? Ripple 4, what? Okay, this is magical. And you'll only know about this if you've played against Shadowborn Apostles or one of the rat decks or now this deck. And it's basically, whenever you cast a Persistent Petitioner, you turn over the top 4 cards of your library because it's Ripple 4. And if there's another Persistent Petitioner in there, you can cast that spell. And then that spell also ripples 4. So you do need a pretty large critical mass of Persistent Petitioners to make Thrumming Stone work. I honestly think that, 25 is just the rough way to be like, oh, well, 100 divided by 4 is 25, so 25. But I honestly think you need to even up it a little bit more from there to consistently activate Thrumming Stone. I would want 27 to 35. I mean, I don't know. Anyways, I'm going to put it in here just because I want to live the dream of making sure I can get every Persistent Petitioner out of my deck and onto the battlefield. Alright, there are a few good things about being a tribal deck, and that means that we can play cards like Kindred Dominance, wipe all your stuff, keep all mine. Kindred Discovery, I'm going to cantrip off of every single Petitioner I play. And Herald's Horn, I'm going to reduce the casting cost. Yes, we want to play just a blue for these creatures. And then also, with the critical mass of advisors, we could be drawing a card every single turn from just this 3-mana artifact. Woo, these cards are good. Maybe we can save this deck with just good tribal synergies. All right, I want to talk about one more thing before we leave, and that's the allure of Big Mill. Big Mill is just taking huge amounts of cards and sticking them in the graveyard, and they are fun and flashy, but they might not be that good. Let's take a look at a few of them. Traumatize. Top half of their deck into their graveyard. Boom. Keening Stone. 11 mana for the first activation. 11 mana. Target player puts the top X cards of his or her library into his or her graveyard, where X is the number of cards in that player's graveyard. You just double the cards in that player's graveyard. Okay, I can see a combo here. Traumatize Keening Stone, suddenly they're dead. Yeah. Dude, guys, I don't know. Right now, we're looking at a 16 mana 2-card combo. How? Okay, I think that you could include these if you're going a little bit more goofy, but if you want to be a little bit better, you gotta stay away from the Big Mill. It's just too splashy. Instead, you need those little enchantments that nickel and dime your opponents with little bits of mill. Let's take a look at some creatures that do Big Mill. Fleet Swallower. Again, if it attacks, it does half. And Ulamog the Ceaseless Hunger, it attacks, they exile 20 cards. I think Ulamog, if you have enough mana rocks, could be good in this deck because it does exile 2 things as it comes in and fits the mill theme. Do you know what kind of big mill effects I like the most? It's a card like Windfall. You're thinking, what, Windfall? But Windfall very regularly gets 7 cards out of your opponent's library. And yeah, that's not exactly mill, but it still reduces the amount you have to get rid of by 7. That's pretty good. Whispering Madness, it just gets cards out of your opponent's library and ciphering onto a little creature that you can ping in just like attack, attack, attack. And then suddenly you're just cycling through your opponent's deck like crazy. Okay, one other sneaky way to end this game, this Big Mill, is just getting a critical mass of Persistent Petitioners. You know, the game's going long, you've gone through a few of them, they finally started killing your petitioners, you realize that you have half your own library in the graveyard, maybe there was some incidental mill here and there, and suddenly what do you play? You play Angel of Glory's Rise. This angel, why do you have this angel? And suddenly you exile all zombies and return all humans from the graveyard to the battlefield, and suddenly you have half a dozen different persistent petitioners, and suddenly you don't have to wait an extra turn, you just tap 4, and then boom, someone's graveyard is full of their entire deck. And finally, we might have the best use for Mill, and that's just using your opponent's spells. Mnemonic Betrayal lets you play with your opponent's graveyards, and guess what? You've been milling things into their graveyards. You get to select the very best of spells and hopefully close out the game that way. Or a card like Animate Dead. In fact, there's tons of Reanimator out there. You could go a Mill Reanimator deck, but the reason why I mention Animate Dead is because it can be fetched up with Zur, and so suddenly you're on the Mill strategy and you realize, oh, my green opponent just milled a Craterhoof Behemoth, and I have a bunch of 1/3s on the battlefield. Could you imagine your opponent's mystification when you suddenly attack with your Zur and all of your 1/3s? You're just like, I'll attack with everything. Imagine what they're thinking. Of course, then you resolve your Zur trigger, get that Animate Dead, pull that Craterhoof out of the graveyard, trigger the pump, and suddenly your opponents realize what's really going on. Alright everyone, I hope you enjoyed this janky build of Persistent Petitioners. If you want to check out how I built the deck, or buy yourself some Persistent Petitioners, go ahead and click on the link in the description. That'll take you to tcgplayer.com. Thank you, tcgplayer.com, and thank you to my patrons. You are amazing and wonderful, and all of you are very beautiful and handsome. I know for a fact. And thank you so much for watching this. What do you think of Persistent Petitioners? Is there another way that we can break this card? I don't know. Let me know in the comments down below. I'll see you all really soon. I have another great deck tech on the way. All right, everyone. Bye.